A roadmap for British politics for the next 3 years as Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, sets out her plans for public spending for the next 3 years. A big political moment on today's episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Hello, sorry to interrupt that sport. It's Adam from Newscast, the BBC's daily news podcast, and you're about to listen to us recording a live episode. So this is warts and all, because normally what we do is we record it and then do a little bit of editing and then it's published on BBC Sounds. So this might not be as slick as a normal podcast, but it will have a whole sort of couple of hours after the spending review feel to it as me and my colleagues try and work out exactly what the government's done today. So wish us luck as we do this live episode of Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the studio.
And it's Chris at Westminster.
And it's Darshini in the studio.
Hello, everybody. Yes, so the spending review was announced by Rachel Reeves at 12:30. It's now 6:40 on Wednesday. I feel that, Darshini, is enough hours to work out exactly what's going on today. Or is it?
Or is it? I've got to say, one very high-profile economist said, I didn't learn anything from the speech, and I'm not quite sure I'm learning much from that. And it is incredibly difficult to leaf through this and find out exactly who is winning and who's losing, which is always the question we want to answer, right? It's not easy, but what we can say is there's a lot of money for future projects. What happens in the meantime? Many more questions.
And Chris, before we dive into the detail of what the government's actually set out today, we should probably just explain what a spending review is. This is the government setting out the budgets for government departments for basically most of the rest of this parliament. But it's not every single pound the government spends, because some of that is on benefits and welfare system, which they don't have a huge amount of control over. This is the stuff that the government can decide to spend money on.
Yeah, it's also worth saying what it isn't. So it's not a budget. So we're not finding out about taxes today. We're not finding out about how much more it'll cost you to buy a pint in the pub. This is about the government's agreed pot of money, i.e. an amount that we already knew, and how it is then divided amongst different budgets around government departments, as you say, into budgets where they can be fixed, they're not vulnerable to the sort of ebbs and flows in the way that, say, benefits might be. And then there's two elements within that we will tease away at, and Darshini was hinting at there. There is day-to-day spending, like paying a nurse or a doctor their monthly salary. And then there is what's known as capital spending, long-term spending, which is sort of building new stuff, like a new road or a new hospital or a thing that will, contribute towards the public sector, but is not a day-to-day thing. And a massive emphasis from the government, both generally and indeed today, has been on that long-term capital spending. The idea being, in their view, that the public realm, the public sector needs that investment, to use the word that Rachel Reeves so likes to use. And they also hope that it can be a turbocharger as far as economic dynamism is concerned, because if that rail line is a bit better, you can get to work quicker. And in the meantime, it's generating jobs because you've got to build the thing. But that inevitably requires a certain patience delivering that kind of stuff, and we're in this political era of impatience. So that's where the politics flows in.
And the short version is that Rachel Reeves is going to spend about £120 billion over the course of the rest of this parliament, more than Chancellor Jeremy Hunt was planning to do when he gave his last budget in spring 2024 before the general election. And here's a slightly longer version of that from Rachel Reeves speaking in the House of Commons at lunchtime.
We are renewing Britain. But I know that too many people in too many parts of our country are yet to feel it. This government's task, my chance, a task as Chancellor, and the purpose of this spending review is to change that, to ensure that renewal is felt in people's everyday lives, in their jobs and on their high streets. The priorities of this spending review are the priorities of working people, to invest in Britain's security, in Britain's health, and to grow Britain's economy so that working people are better off.
Right, let's talk about the things that the government would think are kind of goodies that have been dispensed today. Darshini, pick out something for me that they're spending a lot of money on that maybe the Conservatives wouldn't have done if they'd won the election.
Well, it's interesting, the priorities, there's some very similar priorities here, health in particular, right? And if you look at where the money is going in this, I've got my fingers out and added it all up. And if you look at last year's,
Have you got 120 billion fingers?
I have. I didn't bring them all into the Newscast studio. But if you add up all the extra money that's coming into play over the next 4 years after the end of the last financial year, there's an extra £300 billion plus. Where is it going? About 4/5 of that goes on health, defence and education. So in some ways, not that different to the previous government when it comes to priorities. In terms of the amounts, as you were saying there is more. A lot more of it is going into investment. But a lot of that is happening right now, not later on in the Parliament.
And Chris, the spending on the NHS, it's something like a 3% real terms increase for the NHS budget in England by the end of this Parliament.
Yeah, and there's a couple of things worth teasing out around that. The first one is that, broadly speaking, in proportionate terms, that is generous compared with plenty of other parts of the public sector. The second point, and because the NHS is, takes one heck of, requires, demands one heck of a lot of money, about £4 in every 10 of day-to-day government spending, then, any allocation for the NHS kind of has a disproportionate effect on what happens to other budgets. The other side of the equation around that number is what the NHS has had historically on average, and the extent to which the government concludes that it getting enough money to deliver on its promises, not least getting those waiting lists down, is key. So that's the tussle, that's the trade-off they've had there, because every tenth of a percentage point of increase in the NHS budget, because the number is big, then the percentages are big, or each fraction of a percentage point is big, etc., etc. That the knock-ons elsewhere are very, very real.
And then there's another document published today, which is about the government's efficiency drive, because they did this thing called a zero-based spending review, where they say they went and looked at every single budget line in every single government department and said, do we still need to be spending this much on this? And so there's a separate document which talks about a whole load of efficiency savings in all these government departments. And the biggest efficiency saving, to follow on from what Chris was saying there about the size of the NHS, is from the NHS.
Yeah.
And they've also penciled in saving something like £9 billion a year by the end of this decade from the NHS budget, from just sort of being better. And that's kind of a big thing to have penciled in.
It is a big thing to pencil in. I mean, anyone who has to kind of go through a hospital system or even go to the GP knows there's a lot of ways in which the NHS can be made more efficient. And there is more money going to things like the IT system, make things more joined up, make things more efficient.
Yeah, a doubling of the NHS technology budget.
Absolutely. But does that lead to the kind of efficiency savings the government wants to see? Guess what? Governments keep saying this. Delivering it is harder in practice, right?
Chris, let's talk about defence. We got the big pledge from the Prime Minister earlier this year to increase defence spending in this Parliament. What do we make of where it's actually going to end up?
Yeah, so it's heading to 2.6% of national income by 2027. The promise was to hit 2.5% by then. There's a bit of a rankle and a row going on about quite what's included within it. Some saying, oh, hang on a minute, you're bundling intelligence into that, and therefore...
So like MI6 and GCHQ.
Yeah, now that's not new. We were aware of that, but some criticism has been made to suggest, well, actually, maybe therefore you're slightly overinflating the extent of that rise. And from memory, and I haven't got the exact table in front of me, so excuse me, or maybe you do, beyond 2027, I think the projection suggests that as a share of national income, it remains flat at about 2.6 for a little while. And the reason that matters is there's this ambition to get it to 3% of national income at some point in the first half of the 2030s. And in the far more near term, there is a NATO Defence Alliance summit in the Netherlands in about a fortnight, where there's a lot of talk of 3%, 3.5%, even 5%. Again, there's discussions that are had about what you include within those kind of umbrellas. Defence is clearly a priority for the government. They're absolutely leaning into spending more on it and trying to win a kind of generational argument about the need for the country to devote more to defence. But there's still quite a long way to go if they're going to get close to that 3% figure. And we already know that getting to where they've got to, or they're soon to get to, of course, involves it involves trade-offs, whether it's overseas aid or plenty of other things besides.
And when you look at the breakdown for the individual government departments, it looks like the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office is taking a big hit. But Darshini, the government would say that's because they've already said they're cutting the amount they're going to spend on overseas aid to spend on defence instead.
Well, we heard that again from Rachel Reeves today, right, saying, we have said we're going to do this so that we can beef up defence spending. But when you look at what defence spending is actually made up of, a lot of that is capital spending, investment spending, right, in equipment and the likes, which may sound like
accommodation.
Accommodation. It may sound like I'm being a bit of a nitpicky accountant here, but that does matter for a number of reasons. One, when she talks about the fact that actually we're taking this money from the overseas development, actually some of that money is going elsewhere to other departments to beef up their totals. And when you look at what's going on with defence, particularly in the later years of this Parliament, and that means that the increase in capital spending is largely going to defence, and other departments aren't getting much more added to their investment budgets after 2026. So when you're talking about growth in the round and how we beef up our infrastructure, there are still going to be some difficult choices for some of those departments.
Oh yeah, so Darshini, this is now where we try and do a graph on a podcast, which is a good kind of like descriptive challenge. But this then comes into this graph. Oh, I've got it here on my laptop.
You've got a favourite graph already?
Yeah, I'm now like shut it down. Here we go. It's in the book. It's called Chart 5.1.
Yeah, got
and
it.
Basically it is the just total departmental expenditure from every year from 1998 until 2029. And it shows the story basically is from 1998 in the Blair years, it went up and up and up and up and up. And in the Brown years, David Cameron comes in 2010, it goes down. So obviously that was the austerity era. Then it's kind of downish, flattish for sort of another 6 or 7 years. Then it shoots up when we get COVID. And then it's flat. And then it starts shooting up this year, next year, and a little bit of the year after that. But then, Darshini, it's kind of flattish for the last few years of this Parliament.
I mean, this is after inflation, right? So they've taken account of inflation. And this is something we already knew. And we were talking about even back at the October budget, that when you looked at the spending total she penciled in, because as Chris was saying, we already knew what the overall figure was likely to be for all this. We knew that the big boost came early in this Parliament, and the later years we weren't going to see very much growth. What we didn't know was how that was going to be allocated, and therefore who the winners and losers were going to be. And some of those which are emerging this evening are those particular areas which have seen some pretty tight budgets in recent years. So, some of the things people are talking about, the likes of justice, local government, they are seeing some increases. But they have had, when you look at that fall off in real spending in the last decade, a lot of that has come from those kind of departments. And so they're going to struggle perhaps to keep sort of improving in the way that people might hope.
Yeah, Chris, do you have a take on the timing of this? It seems like kind of lots of spending in the first few years of the Labour government and then sort of holding it flat towards the end.
Yeah, which then makes you wonder what happens in a few years' time. I was talking to a senior Conservative earlier, and by the way, this person acknowledged that they'd done the same thing themselves, which is that assuming that, let's assume nothing changes between now and the tail end of this Parliament. That's a ridiculous assumption because stuff always does. But for the sake of this, given that lots of these projections assume that because they have to when they're printing graphs like the one you elegantly described a moment ago, Chart 5.1.
And by the way, we're putting a link to the spending review documents in the show description, so you can look at it yourself.
How exciting.
This is great. You do wonder, as we get closer to a general election, if there is a situation where the government ends up robbing Peter to pay Paul, in other words, there's a bit of movement out of the planned capital spending and moves into day-to-day, particularly if it's involving a particular project, because these things are quite long-term, that hasn't yet got off the ground. It's a bit tricky to do that if you are midway through doing something and trying to make a virtue of cracking on to a particular deadline. But if something isn't yet off the ground, because obviously a lot of stuff have to go through planning, blah, 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 it can take a long time. Do you get a little bit of shuffling that goes on near an election where a government is going to be even more keen than it is now on keeping an eye on opinion polls, popularity, in the hope of being re-elected? But
Sorry, Darshini, go ahead.
I was going to say, as Chris says, this has been done before, and I think I know who you might have been speaking to, because, it is very reminiscent of previous documents we've looked at. And when you come up close to those election dates, those figures that are penciled in right now to meet the financial rules, they get tweaked because of the way the financial rules are. They're set for sort of 3-5 years in
They're
the future.
forward-looking, yeah.
As you get up to that point, you tend to sort of add a bit more money in and then think about sort of, I'm not going to say fudging, but thinking of making the figures add up later on, right? So sometimes when you look at these figures, you think, is that actually realistic? And particularly, as Chris says, when we're talking about current spending. I mean, the way of looking at the capital spending bit, incidentally, by the way, because that accounts for a lot of that sort of front loading, as we call it, is these things, as Chris was alluding to before, take time to work and take time to deliver growth. So the quicker you can get them off the ground and start spending the money and getting the projects moving, the quicker you're going to see results.
And just on that point about, will Rachel Reeves have to recalculate all of this in a few years' time because either the economy's not delivering as well or the spending pressures have increased in a way they didn't foresee? That was the case being made by the Shadow Chancellor, Sir Mel Stride, in the comments today.
This spending review is not worth the paper that it is written on. Because the Chancellor has completely lost control. This is the spend now, tax later review. Because the Right Honourable Lady knows she will need to come back here in the autumn with yet more taxes. And a cruel summer of speculation awaits.
Now, we don't know if that's a Taylor Swift cruel summer or a Bananarama cruel summer, because both those artists have songs called Cruel Summer. Maybe if Mel Stride would like to get in touch.
Yeah,
give us a little voice note of him singing which one is the answer. Now let's get into the politics of this. Actually, no, let's park the politics for a second and just carry on to discussing the substance of the spending review. Chris, just give us a take on this capital spending, so the longer term spending on stuff, building things, investing in things. What's your take on just what's going to get invested in over the next few years? Because, for example, I'm just really struck by waking up this morning and all the briefing was, surprise, there's going to be £39 billion for a new affordable homes scheme over the next decade. That's the government trying to make a real case for what it wants to do.
Yeah, completely, and it's big. This strategic decision, and this isn't new today. We've just found an element. We found out an element of where various elements of it are going. But this big strategic decision that the government has made, which is that it was going to tweak its self-imposed rules about what is legitimate to borrow for and what isn't. I.e., it's fine to borrow, so they argue, for these long-term projects, but not for day-to-day spending. They think it's absolutely fundamental to their economic strategy, and the challenge they face. I can't remember if I said this on Newsnight. Oh, blimey, Newscast yesterday or the day before, or indeed not at all. So I'll say it again. Which is, I was talking to a Labour MP the other day in with the anticipation of all of this, and they were saying, look, it's all very well, and they're supportive of the government, and they agree with the long term stuff, but they said, when the Prime Minister talks about a decade of national renewal, the danger for Labour is they get halfway through that decade and lose the election, because a lot of this stuff is long term. And so, firstly, does it happen? And then, secondly, even if it does happen and it is appreciated and it delivers an economic stimulus, is that kind of politically too late? Now, to look at some of the specifics, they're very proud of this social and affordable housing money. There's been a big wrangle going on within government about the deliverability of this 1.5 million homes over the Parliament. The aim will contribute towards that, and also, as the Chancellor was keen to say today, to badge it as very much a Labour idea, something you perhaps wouldn't get from a government of a different political complexion. I think on nuclear, which we were reporting on heavily earlier in the week, they are absolutely of the view in government that not only is nuclear vital in terms of its contribution towards net zero, the argument that was also made to me by one senior figure was, look, even if climate change was not a thing and not a concern and carbon emissions didn't matter, if you have nuclear contributing about 14%, I think, of the UK's electricity mix, but a lot of it is going offline quite soon, and demand for electricity is going through the roof. The expectation it could double between now and 2050, then it would be savvy, so the argument goes, that somebody crashed.
There's a poltergeist just come in.
So somebody just crashed in. They had 2 attempts at getting through the door before they realised I was in here. Anyway,
Everyone's welcome.
Absolutely, come in, pull up a seat. Who needs BBC Sound? You can just pull up a seat in here.
Smell Stride comes to the karaoke.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah. Taylor Swift or Bananarama. What? Then so they think nuclear is a sort of key part of the mix. That's a decision. That's a choice. And then the transport infrastructure. Again, that's part of their critique about what they see as a crumbling public realm, but also the value that transport can bring in economic transformation too, particularly beyond London and the southeast of England. And into that mix, by the way, I was just reading whilst you were chatting a contribution on social media from Sir Sadiq Khan, the Labour mayor of London, who is saying, I can't find the tweet now, but the essence of it kind of is.
Thanks to the housing, no thanks to the transport.
Well, yeah, basically that, and
because he's not really getting anything that he wanted,
no, he isn't.
like extending the Bakerloo tube line, for example.
Yeah, and you know what? I was speaking to somebody in central government the other night who was aware of this kind of, irritation from Sadiq Khan. And if you're the mayor of London, you want to be the voice of your city, and you're going to say this kind of stuff, aren't you? And this person in government was saying, the fact that he's grumbling suggests we're getting something right, was the thrust of what they were saying, because they are of the view that the so-called Green Book, this measurer of the efficiency of the spending of public money on big projects, in other words, how much do you get back for what you put in, for too long, in their view, has skewed money being put into London and the South East because it's the most economically productive part of the country. But with the argument going that you then extend the gap between London and the South East and the rest of the UK, rather than attempting to narrow it.
And Darshini, I'm going to give you two very chunky questions in a second, so don't worry, I'm not ignoring you. But just another thing for you, Chris.
Yeah,
we've talked about where spending is going up, where there's opportunities to spend more. What about the places and the government departments where they're not getting more money on them? I'm thinking the Home Office.
Yeah, so am I. And I asked the Chancellor about this earlier. So we heard, didn't we, the argument very publicly, really, from not so much from the Home Office itself, but from
the
those
police chiefs.
Exactly, from plenty of senior police officers who were publicly and repeatedly saying, "Hang on a minute, we're really being squeezed here." I heard from within the Home Office a real sense of, they were quite surprised, I think, at just how difficult it was, because they think, as every government department, but does to a certain lesser or greater extent, they think in the Home Office they're absolutely fundamental to the sort of delivery of public services and the government's priorities, and they felt like they were not a priority. And the Home Office budget is falling. Now, the argument
by 1.4% in real terms.
Yeah, the argument that is made by the Chancellor and others is that's because they want to shrivel to nothing by the end of the Parliament what they're spending on hotels for asylum seekers. Now, that's quite a big ask given the number. I think it's 32,000 asylum seekers currently housed in hotels. There's a separate political question about whether housing them in other places is necessarily more politically palatable. It might be cheaper, but not necessarily more popular. And then the police. So the police, is it the Police Chiefs Council or one of the policing associations has already said that they feel that the money allocated to policing is simply not enough. So now, of course, public services will always make a case that they are deserving of more money, and they only really have to concern themselves with themselves, and others will advocate for other public services. That is the nature of public debate around this kind of stuff. But given how willing they were to be public in advance and how quick they've been to go public afterwards, that is a running sore, I think, that will be interesting to keep an eye on. And Rachel Reeves telling me that the police and others have to make their contribution. Not everyone got what they wanted, and people have to live within their means.
And there's a little linguistic thing about how this spending is described in the documents. It's called police spending power.
Yeah.
And that's because it includes some money from central government and also the extra bit that goes on your council tax to pay for your local police. So if you add those things together, and by the way, assume that council tax will go up by 5% everywhere every year for the next 3 or 4 years, you get to police spending power increasing by 2.3-ish% on average each year, even though actually the central government is not putting that much extra in. Right, Darshini, here are your two big brain teasers. Okay. I sorry should have told you the questions in
I know.
4 minutes ago when I said you're going to have to have two hard questions. Now you just had 4 minutes to stress about how hard the questions are. Number one, and this is an impossible to answer question, but I'll be intrigued to hear what economists think. Is this a recipe for economic growth over the next few years?
Very good question, of course. Look, is this a recipe for economic growth? We're hearing there, right? The money that's gone into investment, this has been a sea change. This has been a deliberate strategy from the government. And when you look at the proportion of public investment of GDP, 2.6%, right? That is about 50% higher as a percentage of GDP than the average for the previous 15 years. So that gives you an idea of some of the repair that's being done.
I mean, that is a splurge. And a splurge is a sort of loaded word, but I think what you just said justifies that word.
It's splurge. And then there is the current spending as well, right? And don't forget, we are doing this against a backdrop of a pretty tricky time for the UK economy. If you look, for example, at jobs figures that came out yesterday, we're seeing a lot of private sector areas, in particular retail, hospitality. They say it's to do with higher taxes. Who knows? A lot of those are cutting jobs, right? But that's where we're seeing the jobs being shed. We are still seeing public sector jobs increasing at the moment. So this extra money will help to deliver growth both in terms of current spending and also capital spending as well. Will it be enough? That is the big question, of course. And when you look at the forecast at the moment, and don't forget, we already knew these big numbers, it doesn't look like things are going to change very quickly. What does that mean when we get to that October, November, December, who knows, the autumn budget? When we get to that, economists are saying this evening, you are likely to have to see tax rises just to get these current plans funded and within the financial rules. So brace yourself. I think it's going to be another chunky one. Some people are talking about 10, 20 billion pounds of extra tax.
Right. And then my second chunky question is, okay, a lot of this is paid for by increased borrowing. Now, Rachel Reeves can sort of give herself a tick because it's borrowing that's increased within her fiscal rules, which allow her to borrow more than her predecessors would have done with their self-imposed fiscal rules. But we have to borrow from the bond markets. What are they thinking about this? Is because you can get to a stage where the bond markets think a country is borrowing too much. Yeah. They sort of penalise you for that.
Borrowing too much and borrowing for the wrong reasons as well, obviously. And she's been quite careful with designing those fiscal rules to try and say, look, I'm borrowing for a cause. I'm investing in the future. So in the future, I may not have to borrow quite so much, not her, but whoever comes next. But as Chris was pointing out, when you look at how she's got 1.5 trillion pounds to spend in 2029. Less than half of that is going on the kind of things we're talking about, because things like welfare, things like debt interest are taking up a larger chunk of the pie. But when you look at the bond markets today, they barely budged because there was nothing really new in these plans. But we do know that they are pretty nervous because of what's happening in the global picture. And that's something that the Chancellor has learnt she's got to be quite wary of. And that, of course, is something that's going to keep her on her toes, because come the autumn, if they're still feeling fairly jittery, any extra borrowing that goes on top of this, that could cause some issues.
I think we're heading for a bit of a flip in the debt conversation because of Liz Truss's mini budget, the focus was all on what is the yield. In other words, what's the interest rate the British government has to pay today to borrow a few billion pounds on the global markets. And we've been fixated on that number, and it's gone up and then it came back down, but it's been creeping up again. I wonder though if we're now going to flip to a conversation about just the stock of the debt, the total amount of the debt, because that's what it means for the total interest payments every year and all the things people might like to be spending that money on instead that they can't, because we're basically paying back our creditors in the international markets.
£1 in every 12.
Yeah.
£1 in every 12 of government spending is going on, debt interest.
And that would take us back to a very sort of like 2009, 2010 kind of conversation, rather than a question about what the actual bond yield that day is. Right, Chris, let's get really, really political now. I mean, this has all been political, obviously. It doesn't just sort of, it's not the laws of physics, but let's listen to Rachel Reeves again. And this is a supercut of just some of the times she said one particular word starting with a C.
My choices are different. Austerity was a destructive choice. My choices are Labour choices. These are Labour choices. Compare that to the Conservative choice. I have made my choices.
Right. The word choice appeared. That was the C word I was referring to, by the way, in case anyone was worried.
I wondered if the word was going to be investment, because that's the other, that's obviously the other word that she was very keen on today. Yeah, it's a good word to pick out. And, I think this was kind of part of her attempt to, well, firstly, I mean, just in pure factual terms, as we try and get across in our reporting on days like this, it is about choices. The choices point in a million different directions, and that's the that's the joy/headache of government, depending on the mood of any minister on any given day. I think there was an absolute attempt in Rachel Reeves's rhetoric today, in the way that she formulated the argument she made out loud, to talk about this, to badge this very much in a Labour rosette, to try and mark that contrast between, firstly, the Conservatives. She did that in the opening minutes when she was talking about the spending cuts in the 2010s. And then, with remarkable speed, on a day where you can choose the extent to which you sort of name check and refer to your political opponents or not, she was talking about, I was really struck by this, she was talking about the parties, plural, opposite. Quite often the throwaway line in parliamentary knockabout is the party opposite, where the government is referring to the principal party of opposition, His Majesty's official opposition, or vice versa. But no, it was the parties of opposition. And within 10 minutes, a pitch that was directly in Reform UK's direction. And then it looped back towards the end of her speech with another go at Reform UK on one of these big set-piece parliamentary occasions, which tells you everything about where Labour feel the pressure towards them is coming and how they want to badge as clearly as they can. And there are critics, including at senior levels within the government, who think the government needs to be much, much, much clearer in its storytelling, in selling what it's about, what it's for, who it's for. But that I think was part of their attempt today, to badge it very much as this is a Labour programme and this is how it is different from if you had Kemi Badenoch in Downing Street, Nigel Farage in Downing Street, or recent Conservative predecessors of Keir Starmer.
And picking up on your point about who she was pitching as her political opponent here, I think you can always tell a lot by the main joke. So all of these fiscal events. Oh, sorry, is this a fiscal event? And as we've discussed many times, yes. Anyway, never mind.
Event.
All these things. When the Chancellor does a big thing, when they read out loads of numbers, sometimes with the red budget box, sometimes not. There's always one set piece joke. Right. And the set piece joke is always quite revealing about where they think the trouble is coming from or who they need to attack. I remember George Osborne one year. It would be he took the mickey out of Boris Johnson and said, we're going to refurbish the Battle of Britain bunker in his constituency because that's where Churchill plotted his war from. Oh, right. You obviously think Boris Johnson needs to be taken down a peg or two. Then I remember there was a couple of years where he would do jokes about Wallace and Gromit, which was to basically humiliate Ed Miliband, the Labour leader at that point, to make Labour not seem even credible. The joke today from Rachel Reeves was a Westminster-based pub joke where she said Reform's favourite pub should be the two chairmen. And I just think that shows the energy that they put into the jokes reveals who they want to attack. Darshini, you're sort of scoffing, but
I'm not scoffing.
This is how you read the runes, Also, the two chairmen is where the people from the Treasury go to celebrate
the day after.
Big days like this. So,
but can we call it a fiscal moment, even if we can't call it a
fiscal moment, yeah. Right, we're coming to the end of this episode of Newscast. On the previous episode, I made 6 predictions about what would happen today. Would you like to mark my homework?
Oh, yes.
Except I'm now looking at these predictions thinking, they're a mixture of medium and long term.
Come on, stop. Forget your excuses. Come on, number one.
Okay. Right. Yep. 6 things that political consequences of the spending review. I said, number 1, we will see what the consequences are of the defence spending pledge. Sort of, but not as clearly as I thought we maybe would. Because I was thinking, I think when I was saying that yesterday, I was thinking, oh wow, we're going to be spending so much more in defence, there will not even be like pennies left for anyone else. Actually, I realised I was exaggerating. That's what I've learned from that prediction.
Well, that's kind of happened, but there's more to go. So I think we'll wait for
season,
the next season, basically.
Yeah.
2,
you'll be right eventually.
Yeah. We will see the government's latest view of its own priorities, which may be different from what its previous priorities were.
I think the first bit's right, and perhaps less so the second bit, because I think broadly it was of a piece with what we expected, I think, their priorities to be, but everything is in the detail, and we've only got so much detail so far. There'll be more to come in the coming weeks.
One of the missions was about crime and disorder and safer streets, and actually one of the things that looks like is not getting loads of money is safer streets, so you could argue maybe that mission is not as priority as the other ones.
The counter might be that it's not always about money. Yeah. So let's see.
It's not always about money, but also health. We've talked a lot, and as Chris has mentioned earlier, NHS England getting 3% a year. Some people are saying that's not quite enough to keep up with the plans for improving the NHS. So when you're talking about prioritising health, are you going to be able to deliver what you want to?
Right. Prediction 3, the government will stop doing some things as a result of this spending review? I just don't think we know that yet, do we?
We don't, but they will, I think. And for me, the medium term sort of seed to plant here is, let's fast forward 2, 3, 4 months, and this is a hypothetical, but what happens when it is suddenly discovered in a particular department that Programme X, that has been running for the last 15 years, quietly doing whatever it's doing and has been cancelled for whatever reason, and then suddenly there's a row that it stopped doing something that they wish it was still doing. And we know, it could be, and as I say, I'm sort of making this up, but that's where there's a slow burn to this, in the way that often with budgets, things can take 72 hours, what's more than 72, 96 hours, 100, I don't know, whatever, a few days to potentially unravel or things to emerge. This could be a slower burner on that.
And what I was getting at there was the fact, back to this idea of it being a zero-based review, where they've gone through every line of spending. That means there must be some lines of spending that have gone to zero or are being reduced. And actually, on that efficiencies document that came out alongside the spending review, it seems like a lot of slimming down of government departments and things like not hiring contractors or consultants. So
We've had that before, though.
Yeah, but I just think if that could be stuff that people could notice that.
The hotels for asylum seekers, as you were saying there before, that's something they are thinking is going to get down to zero, but obviously big question mark about how that's going to happen.
Right. Number 4, there will be winners and losers. Yep, we discussed that already. I mean, that was me giving me a freebie because I knew that was definitely going to happen. I mean, come on. I've been learning from some of the best politicians over the last few decades.
Number 5, the Chancellor will leave from an address starting number 11.
Yes. From a street in central West London.
SW.
Labour MPs will start to realise the reality of Rachel Reeves's fiscal rules, and they might not like it. Today's not the day that they realise that, though, is it? Because today's about, here's the extra stuff I could do because of the fiscal rules.
Yeah, this is almost the flip side to what we've often heard around the critique from some of the fiscal rules, because the fiscal rules always, part of their recasting was giving her the space to do all of this longer term stuff, as well as the equally self-imposed limitations on the now.
But it is interesting because actually you realise the beauty in political terms for Rachel Reeves of the the affordable housing pledge is that it's very hard for a very left-wing MP to say you should be borrowing more to spend more, when she's just stood up and said, I'm going to spend £39 billion on social rent.
But then, there's a presentational issue which had some of us tearing our hair out, which is that they have presented these numbers starting from the current financial year, right? When in actual fact, the new news is for what's happened in the next 3 years. We already know what's happening this year. We already know this is where the big boost in growth for spending both departments in terms of day-to-day services and investment comes in. So the way these numbers look, they're flattered by putting the 4 years together rather than singling out those 3 years. So there'll be a bit of penny dropping, put it that way, I think, for some MPs.
Okay, and my 6th pledge, because we're talking about politicians making pledges, my 6th prediction, which actually has turned out to be true, is think tankers, economists and opposition parties will say the government are being too naive or optimistic and that taxes will ultimately have to go up at some later point. And that's what they did say.
Yes, and to an extent, 'twas ever thus, to a greater or lesser extent, with almost every sort of fiscal event / moment / review or whatever.
Again, I had to give myself another one that was guaranteed to be right.
I think you've been doing too many of them.
2 out of 6. 2 out of 6, I would say, are definite ticks there.
Yeah.
That's all right.
And the others are...
That's kind of, it gives yourself headroom to improve.
Headroom.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, headroom. There's another little fiscal term. Yeah, exactly. Right. That is all from us. Darshini, thank you very much. And thank you for bringing the actual blue book into the Newscast studio.
Quite a nice blue, actually.
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't paint my house in it. But.
Okay.
And Chris, as you flick through yours, what have you got written on the back?
Oh, yeah.
Is this your notebook for the day?
Yeah, I've got my questions that I put to Rachel Reeves earlier on. I'm making the most of this blank piece of paper at the back of the spending review. I suddenly realised I didn't have my notebook. Why am I going to write these questions out? I'll write them on the back. Don't write them on the front because I want to wave it around on the 6 o'clock news. Yeah. Write them on the back. And then I get rumbled on Newscast.
How the sausage is made.
Yes.
Right, Chris, thanks to you too.
Ta-ra.
And that's all for this episode of Newscast. Thank you very much for listening. We'll be back with another one very soon.